Professor Heckman, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm ready to go. Yes. I just fixed setting up here. Okay. Let me turn this off so I don't get distracted. Okay, well, thank you very much. I guess there was some confusion about the time, and I regret very much causing you inconvenience. There must have been some misunderstanding here. But nonetheless, I'm really delighted to be able to participate in this event and to share with you work. I know two of you. Of course, T was a graduate student at the University of Chicago many years ago now, but a first-rate student. And we share a common friend, Rob Townsend, then at Chicago when T was here, and now at MIT. But Rob has worked very hard and done a lot of great work with T on developing understanding of the Thai economy and the process of development. So I'm I've learned a lot from Rob when he was here in Chicago, but I also know something else about Thailand because my daughter-in-law is Thai, as it turns out, and her father and mother were migrated directly from Thailand, and her father was actually until recently a director of a pharmacology college here in Thailand. So I do know something about Thailand, but I've only been there once, and it was when T invited me almost 10 years ago, maybe longer. But anyway, it's really delightful to be able to talk again, if only through Zoom, and to be able to share some ideas and to talk about human development, which is a deep interest of mine. And it's a deep interest in many people around the world. And I'll try to convey why understanding human development is so important, and then what we've come to understand about the principles of creating effective human development strategies. And in this area, I think there's a lot of exciting research that's being done. And I will try to keep you up in what I know, latest that I know. We're organizing a conference here in a week and a half. I guess T will participate, if only virtually. And we will organize leaders with some of the latest developments of ways to think about fostering human development. So we know that the challenge in the world is everywhere, namely poverty, inequality, and social immobility. There are serious challenges that we face in this world. And the question is, how do we address those changes? This kind of graph has made a very powerful presence in the world of academics and policy. This is a relationship between, on the one hand, at the bottom, on the x-axis, inequality of family incomes measured by a Gini coefficient. So giving us some measure, larger values of Gini are associated with more inequality across families. And the coefficient on the left-hand side, the axis, the y-axis, if you will, is the relationship between a child's income and the family income. And this relationship is something that's extremely important in terms of creating the sense of social mobility. So when beta, this coefficient relating family income to child income is 0, it means that you have a society that's highly mobile. But when beta is close to 1, or it gets very high, it doesn't have to, it could be bigger than 1, technically it could be bigger than 1. But whatever it is, the higher the value of beta, the stronger the dependence between family income and child income. This can also be measured through correlations, but I'm just showing you what is called a regression coefficient. And this model of social mobility, this empirical model, is estimated around the world. And you can see that where it's been measured, in Latin America in particular, beta is very high, suggesting that there's a lot of social stratification and a lot of importance of family conditions on child outcomes. And so many people see beta, a low value of beta, as a desirable goal. And so if you look over in the left-hand corner where the betas are low, you see that some of these countries like Norway, Denmark, and Finland have a very low beta, which means there's a lot of mobility. the family of income and the child's income are not that closely related. And that is giving a lot of people thinking that they should emulate what the kind of Nordic welfare states. I'll come back to that in the end, because I think that's a mistaken understanding of this graph. But nonetheless, many famous economists have worked on trying to understand this graph. And people will say, oh, the greater the inequality, the more the unequal is access to income, the more unequal family income is, which means that there are very poor children and very rich children, and the rich children get advantages and the poor children don't. So the question is, this relationship is at least an empirical relationship. It could go either way, though. So as a technical mathematical matter, it can be that the higher the value of beta, the bigger the income. Why? Bigger this kind of inequality or the measure. It's just a mathematical artifact that if beta is very high, you're going to produce unequal incomes. So that means then that the relationship is going to be very, very high of inequality for the family. So there's a real question about what causes this relationship. And in the empirical literature in the United States and in OECD countries, this curve is sometimes called the Gatsby curve. Now, what do people do? What's the traditional approach? And this is an approach that's very much favored by many religious and political figures around the world. Namely, the traditional approach to poverty and social immobility is to give alms to the poor. And what that means is we think, well, if people are poor, we should help them, because poverty, after all, is measured by income, or many people measure it by income. We'll come back to whether that's the right thing to do. And therefore, obviously, if we give money to the poor, they won't be poor anymore. And so this is formalized in the welfare systems of Western Europe through a tax and transfer system. So taxing the very rich and then redistributing the goods to the very poor. And in fact, the tax rates for the wealthy are very progressive in Denmark and in Scandinavia. Although in fact, just as a factual matter, recent work has shown that actually in the US, there is more redistribution. But it's not because we're taxing the rich so much as they're giving so much income to the poor. So there's a massive amount of redistribution at the bottom in the United States. But traditionally there wasn't. So the question is, should we just imagine saying poverty is a condition and we should just stay with that condition and not worry about and just transfer income to those individuals? Well, we tried that in the United States 60 years ago. And this is part of a broader strategy to end poverty and to create equality across generations. And the idea was if you give people money, you obviously end poverty. And if you give the parents money, they will spend it wisely and they will spend it on their children's development. So the goal would be then to improve the well-being of the next generation by giving the current parents income, housing, and a variety of amenities that was associated with higher levels of income. And there was also another approach to this war on poverty. It had an approach called, I'd call a shotgun skills strategy. There was a feeling that we could improve the skills of people across the life cycle. So an unemployed steel worker in Buffalo, New York, who was 65 years old and had been laid off because the technology that he'd been using and working with his whole life had become obsolete. We could retrain that worker to become a more effective modern day, say, internet user or high-speed computer user, or somehow develop skills that would bring the person into the modern economy. And so there wasn't a clear understanding of where it was most suitable, where the returns were highest to invest in the life cycle of individuals. But we've come to understand that much better. And we've come to understand that investments have different productivity at different stages of the life cycle. And I want to talk about that today and where the strategies are best. So it turned out, as a fact, if you look at the so-called war on poverty launched in America 60 years ago, the welfare policy subsidized poverty enclaves, and it ended up detaching the poor from society. And that was a serious issue And so the serious issue was that literally the structure was that the underlying group of people, there were a number of rules and regulations that were imposed, and they were imposed on these individuals to essentially try to protect society from giving money to the non-deserving people, and then to make sure that people who were already wealthy or had some means weren't given transfers. But this created a two-class society. It separated individuals who were very poor from the rest of society, and it isolated them. And it created what in the United States we call ghettos. Ghettos are these groups of places where people are detached. And it created a less than perfect notion about how people were integrated into the larger society. And so the idea of social mobility and social equality was seriously compromised. But we didn't know that starting. So many years later, President Clinton ended that, and we had a new policy towards the poor. So starting in the 1990s, so this is the relationship that actually happened in the US starting in the 1970s, when we could start measuring the data. And what this shows is it shows the intergenerational correlation of welfare participation. And what it shows is that if the children were on welfare, in other words, if the children were poor and getting transfers, the children of the welfare participants were poor, or were they not poor? In other words, if the correlation was very low and this line was flat around 0, it would mean that people who started in poverty ended up way above being in poverty in the next generation. So that intergenerational mobility was reduced and income inequality then was made more, income was made more equal, and the starting chances of life were less important. But what happened anyway with this welfare system, detaching people from the workforce, detaching people from the larger society, was that it actually created more welfare dependence. So we see that even in the period when President Clinton was starting to try to reduce welfare participation by putting work requirements and so forth, that in fact the correlation between a child standing, this relationship I introduced a minute ago, that this relationship became stronger, not weaker. And so one of the hopes of that transfer policy faded and failed. And I think that's very important that we take a look at that. I think it's extremely important that we take a look at it. So we also know that early days in those policies were very regressive. We've changed that. The new policies eliminate the tax on earnings for the poor. It incentivizes work. The US now has a progressive tax and transfer policy. So that in fact, this idea that America is not very progressive is false. We're very progressive, but we still have a hardcore of poor people. And we have groups of people who can participate even though their taxes are no longer high. They are eligible for participating in programs like Social Security, disability, and many other programs that essentially create a problem for the poor, that essentially incentivize people not to work. In fact, some of the recent programs that the US instituted in the wake of the COVID shutdown had the incentive of paying people substantial sums of money not to work, and therefore it eliminated this kind of incentive to actually acquire skills and move up. What I want to argue, though, that today, and it's a policy that I think is far more effective than cash transfer, is that to alleviate poverty and inequality, we should enhance skills of individuals. You build skills, not relying on taxes and transfers, but I would argue that you still need to move away from the policies that are currently in place. So instead of relying on alms to the poor or relaxing on tax and transfer policy, what we can do is we find essentially the structure was such that we have a much greater transfer policy that essentially looks at transferring skills and building skills. A focused skill enhancement policy that draws on recent knowledge about the dynamics of skill formation. And that's what I want to talk about today. So what do we know about skills? A lot has been known since even the time that T was a graduate student at Chicago. But certainly from the early days, even when Gary Becker was writing on this some 60 or 70 years ago now, that what we've come to understand is what skills are important, how we can build them, and how important different skills are. And what we also have come to understand is that policies that are successful promote inclusion and social mobility by fostering skills. Those are effective policy matters. So promoting inclusion and social mobility is actually an effective policy, and it boosts growth rate and it builds successful lives. So by changing the skills, the capacities of agents, human beings, people in the society to work, to engage with others, to create a common social body, a society, is a very powerful way to essentially enhance lives and to build and to inclusion and to build human dignity. And this is what I really want to talk about today. What we also know from a purely economic standpoint, though, is that a skilled workforce is flexible, adaptable, and productive. Building skills creates dignity, agency, and engagement. But I want to show you what an approach that's very successful to building skills. So let's take a look at what the sources of inequality are. The sources of inequality in society today are largely a consequence of bad social policy. We know that. We know that certain kinds of restrictions, certain kinds of distortions on the way the society, the economy works can really be forcing people into poverty. You know, restrictions that don't allow people to form their own businesses, that don't allow people to invest in themselves or in their businesses. But the real question is, how do we get around the problem? And I want to argue that a fundamental source of poverty that we don't sufficiently account for is family and the early years. And I guess the question is, how do we address these social problems? And there's a real problem in social policy here. The policy is, should we address these problems as they arise, or should we prevent them from occurring in the first place? So let me give you some examples. A lot of people talk about fragmented solutions. Here in the United States, we have a big rise in crime. And so many people, correctly, I think, are talking about having more police and more safety in of a public nature to protect individuals from the larger criminal population that seems to be becoming more active. But I think what's happened for skill policy is this fragmentation. For many policies, people seem to think there's a solution that's specific to that policy. And many people, politicians, well-intentioned professionals, doctors, lawyers, police, various individuals who are at different edges of society, different tasks of society, will see a problem and they will think of solving it in their particular way. And they want to think of a solution that's designed to address one problem and one problem alone. So, for example, if there's an employment problem, we might think of reducing the barriers to employment, to subsidize job creation, maybe using taxes. And if we have higher crime, to have more police or soldiers on the street. For health, have more doctors. And if you have worry about teenage pregnancy, you have pregnancy prevention programs. And if you want to reduce inequality, you give cash transfers. And to promote skills, you build schools. Now, none of these are bad ideas. I'm not going to say don't build schools, don't have police, don't have hospitals. That's crazy. But what I want to argue is the kind of solution I'm talking about today alleviates almost all these problems. It helps reduce the scale of these problems and works in ways that are not fully understood. And once we fully understand these, then I think we're going to find ourselves in a much better way of thinking about what effective social policy would be. So I think the most effective solutions aren't necessarily the fragmented ones. I think we need to rethink public policy not to eliminate these fragmented solutions, but to bolster them, and maybe to seriously reduce the scale of the problems that each one of those factors tries to address. So the real question, there's a proverb in the United States that only the squeaky wheel should get the grease. And by that, we mean, obviously, if there's a problem, then address the problem and don't waste time on problems that don't exist. And many people will say, you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's the way people would like to think about something. That's the motto of many, many people, public officials, public policy analysts, economists, and social analysts around the world. So should we just wait for problems to appear? There's obviously a logic there, because we don't want to solve, we can't solve all problems, and at least we know what problem we need to solve, and therefore we address those problems. But I think we want to think more constructively about social policy. And the way to think about it is to think crucially in how well we can predict later life problems and target populations at risk. So here's a finding that was published recently in Nature Human Behavior, a few years ago by a very distinguished social scientists, psychologists, and epidemiologists at Duke University and University College London. And they use something called the Pareto principle. The Pareto principle is not what some economists may know about Pareto optimality, making some people better off without making anybody worse off. This is another principle of Pareto. Pareto had many good ideas. And one idea that he had was the notion that 20% of the actors account for 80% of the results. And this is something that people find hard to believe, but it's true in crime. And so I'll show you an example. So what it turns out that is a high need, high cost population uses more than half of resources in multiple sectors. And the most high need, high cost people share risk factors that can be identified early in life. And as I will show you in a minute, targeting these early life risks is important enough to warrant investment in early years to prevent these problems from appearing. So here's an example. There's a study that's been done in New Zealand for the last 40, 50 years by Terry Moffat and Avshalom Caspi and Belsky and others who worked with them. And what they found is they followed a group of people born some 45, 50 years ago throughout their lifetime. So these people are now in their middle age, heading towards their old age, but still very productive years. But over the time from when they're very young to their current now middle-aged years, what we can follow is what those children are doing, what those people are doing. So it turns out that 22% of the people they studied form a group that's very tightly impacted. And for New Zealand, they account for 66% of the social welfare. They account for 77% of fathers without children, 59% or 54% of people who are smoking, 40% of the excess weight, the obesity. And if you look, for example, at crime, 80% of the criminals. And by the way, this statistic has been found for many countries around the world, just on crime, not just that. So there's a concentrated group of people who are causing many of these problems. They're the ones who are in the social welfare system. These are the ones who pose a challenge. And so we can see that 20% of the cohort members are getting something like 80% of the social welfare benefits that are designed to alleviate poverty and to create opportunity for people in the society. And if you look at another piece of the group, say some 30% where the risk factors are very low, their profile in the social welfare service is close to 0% of the crime over their lifetimes. And you can see very tiny percentages of things like excess weight, smoking, fatherless children, being on welfare, and even if you look at injury claims, which is an ambiguous category. So the society really does bifurcate. And what's interesting is that it can be identified very early on. So we look at composites at age 3, 5, 7, and 9, and 11. And we can see measures of things that we can isolate, IQ, self-control, the socioeconomic status, maltreatment of the family. So the family treatment of children plays a huge role in ways that we don't. So many people think of child poverty as just a matter of no income and need to give income to people. There's a whole group of people here in the United States who are going around the world saying, oh, give people more money. They want universal basic income, and that's going to solve all these problems. But when we look at real factors that determine child poverty and causing problems that go down the road, it's not low income in the early childhood years. It's actually family situations and environments that are much less healthy for some children than for others. So we need to really operate on that in creating successful social policy. So we need to think about how we can close achievement gaps. And we need to think beyond just thinking of the school or the university or even the elementary schools as being the major focus of activity. And the notion that focuses on schools, I know that many United Nations organizations, UNESCO and many other groups, I have nothing against UNESCO, I have nothing against the United Nations group, they're all very good and they're very well intentioned. But the ILO and UNESCO and OECD focus on schooling really misses a fundamental feature of skill formation, and that is the role of the early years in a child's life. Schools play a role, but they're not the dominant role, nor can schools alone close these gaps. We need to understand the skills that are life relevant. And so what we've come to understand, and I've been part of this group, there are many others actively engaged in this group, and I can give you lists of names if you're interested, but there's recent research shows the benefits of cognitive, social, and emotional skills in enhancing the capacities of persons to function in many aspects of economic and social life. And it used to be called soft skills, these kinds of skills about emotional regulation, what some psychologists call executive functioning, the ability to stay on course, the ability to make effective decisions. These are skills that are important for life outcomes that only recently we've studied. And for example, I'll give you some examples of some of these skills. There are a lot of advances that have occurred in understanding the skills that matter. Cognitive ability is important. There's no question about it. But IQ alone is not the story. That used to be thought to be the story. 60 years ago, cognitive ability was falsely equated with the skill that was needed in life. Cognitive psychology more or less told people that. But as we've studied this as economists, we realize that if you look at the present value of earnings, a measure of discounted future income, that only 4 to 5, maybe 10% at most of the variability among people in lifetime earnings can be explained by IQ. These other skills play powerful roles. How motivated people are, how motivated they are to show up on time, how well they interact with others, what their attention is, the self-regulation, the self-esteem, the ability to defer gratification, and the health and mental health. So what I want to argue is that IQ alone explains at most a small part of the variability in lifetime earnings among people. And what we know, and we've come to understand, there's a lot of work in economics and in psychology and in epidemiology as well, that higher levels of both cognitive and social and emotional skills are associated with reduced crime, higher earnings, better health, higher civic participation, greater educational attainment, less teenage pregnancy, more control of a young girl over her life, greater trust, and more human agency, the ability to decide your own life, to shape your own values, and to participate in a constructive way in society. And these skills are the principal outputs of successful schools and families. People look at PISA scores, and PISA scores are important. People look at achievement tests. Yes, they're important, but they're only part of the story. And I think we need to understand that they're really a small part of the story. So how do we produce successful skills? Skill formation starts early in the womb. In fact, there's a whole body of literature now that shows that mothers who are carrying the child. The child is still in the uterus, is still in the womb, still basically being nursed. Those environments that are external to the family become part of the child's life as internalized through her blood system. The stress that she feels is shared with the child. And so environments, and they have lasting effects. So we've seen that children born in periods of starvation, when the womb is not getting nutrients, the mother's not getting nutrients, and so forth. They're much more likely to have disease later in life. They're much more likely to be less effective in creating successful lives, and in terms of cognitive and social and emotional skills. So what do we know about the early years? Well, it's very hard to measure IQ before age 3. It'd be nice if we did. Some people talk about Bailey scores, and there are a whole series of measures. I've been working with those measures, but I wouldn't call them IQ. But what we do see, we can measure achievement tests, how well people can acquire factual knowledge, how much they know. And this graph has been emulated, it's been reproduced in many countries around the world. So if you look, for example, the test scores of children born to highly educated women, that the score at age 3 is pretty close to the score. These are relative ranks, so they're relative ranks. These people learn more, but they keep their advantage that they had at 3 throughout their whole life, up to 18 and even later. If you look at children born to the very disadvantaged, you can see there's a huge gap at age 3, and the gap continues to age 18. So these gaps are more steady than we would like to admit. And there's a real question about what causes those gaps. Now, many people who believe in eugenics or believe in genetic determination are strongly saying, oh, this is just genes, that the smart kids are born to the smart parents. And so these are educated parents, they're smart, so they just pass their genes on to their kids. These are the parents who aren't so highly educated, and maybe they're not so very smart. So that's the genetic interpretation. And many people still cling to that explanation. Many people here, even in the United States, very much supporting the idea of genetics. But I want to convince you that's not true. That we know that we can change the IQs, we can change the motivation, we can reduce these gaps by a class of interventions, and I'll explain what they are. So what we can learn, and what the societies are beginning to learn, and what recent research is demonstrating, is the wisdom of investing more in prevention and less in remediation. So the business of starting early, creating a secure foundation that actually will help alleviate these gaps in skills that I just showed you. So we know that if we invest in families and social environments, not just schools, we can see that these are major producers of the skills of children. And that if we really fully understand this, that the family is the cornerstone of effective skill development. And human policy, social policy, really has to build around this. So what have we learned about the importance of the early years? We've learned something very important, namely that skills beget skills. If you start skill-based early, it becomes easier to acquire skills through the rest of your life. So if a highly trained, highly motivated child is given new challenges, say at age 3, at 4, and 5, and then at age 18, that at each of those subsequent ages, the child is better able to take advantage of. And this in turn, because of the dynamic economics here, what economists would talk, value function determination for investment in skills, well, we've come to understand that those early years play a crucial role. And we know that supporting families and engaging and nurturing their children is going to be the key to success. And this is something that has only recently been understood, because so much emphasis has been placed on school, so much on government programs. But in the end, we all know at a deeply intuitive level that it's the family, it's the family, it's the family. And what we do with the family is crucially important. So what I want to talk about are programs that are cost-effective and fair. But let me give you an idea of how powerful family environments are. This is an old study done now close to 30 years ago, and it's been replicated though. And if we look at children from the very poor, these are called welfare. But these kids know when they're young kids in their very early years, that the kids say at the early years are hearing about 600 words per hour, okay? So in a typical hour, you're going to hear 600 words. And the parenting style is generally one of more prohibitions and less affirmation. Among professional, more educated families, it's almost 4 times, 3.5 times as many words. And what you see is also affirmations, much more likely. So encouraging the child to learn, to take advantage of opportunities, to take risks and therefore learn things. We know that learning is fundamentally about taking risks, learning even from mistakes. Actually, I had a conversation a few years ago. Jack Ma, the famous billionaire in China, who's run many commercial enterprises, very highly successful enterprises. Jack Ma came here to Chicago, and a group of us met with him. And he said, you know, what was he doing at his institute? What was he doing with his company? That he said he had a whole university for his employees, and basically the program was actually teaching people, his employees, to fail. And what he meant by that is to take chances, to try new things. Failure is the other side of exploration. So a lot of things we try fail. The crucial thing is we don't give up. So we try and fail. We try and fail, but we don't fail to try again. That's the important notion here. And I think parenting and affirmation of support of children in that learning enterprise, it turns out to be far more powerful than we ever realized. So it's not a question of building a school or getting better textbooks or getting teachers with higher qualifications. It's a matter of nourishing the child in this fundamental task of exploration, whether it's in the school or in the backyard, exploring something about the nature of the structure of a little worm crawling on the side, various kinds of things like that. These are the learning activities. And it's not taught that way in education school. Many people will not, but that is what it's all about. It's not a question of having a teacher stand in front of you. I think a lot of academics are so accustomed to the standard teaching situation that they don't recognize how important it is, even for their students, to try things on their own, to fail, and to do projects that cause them maybe to feel badly for a while, but then teach them things they didn't know through failure. And this gap that I was telling you earlier has been replicated in the United States. This is just a more recent version of the same story by 2 people done some 10 years ago now in Science magazine. And this is a showing that children from more advantaged environments are learning at a faster rate, and they acquire higher levels of vocabulary. And we've also seen in the United States anyway, I don't know what the data is for Thailand. I wish I did. I wish there was more data available, at least to me. I couldn't find a lot of data on this question. If there is, I would certainly be grateful for receiving it and working with it. But you can see what's happened in the United States as there's been more concern and understanding about the importance of the early years. The more affluent people have invested heavily. So the amount of money in 2008 dollars invested in children starting 50 years ago was about $3,000. And then it almost tripled, at least doubled for sure, and 2.5, say. It rose. If you look for the poorest people, the amount of investment, it increased, but at a much lower rate. So this is a source of gaps. This is a source of social inequality itself. So what do we know? We know that home environments are associated with child outcomes. And what we've come to understand, and he is working on this, and my other host here on this channel, whom I met in Korea, knows that early childhood programs substantially reduce achievement gaps and produce better child outcomes. So successful interventions work with and encourage parents. They promote this interaction I was talking about, and they allow the child to engage with the parent and to have support from the parent, and at the same time for the parent to lead the child in creating an exploration. And I think these parent-child interactions are not fully understood, but these are really the source of much learning. So there are proven programs, and let me talk about this. I know that T has introduced some of these programs to Thailand, and I know that others are under consideration. So I will talk about these programs, what we know about them, and what I take as some general lesson that we have from these programs. So they're a proven effective program. So for example, consider the Perry Preschool program. This is a program that starts children ages 3 to 4. This has been very influential in the United States. It takes children away from the family 2 hours a day, 5 days a week during the school year. The ABC Darien program is another program that starts earlier at age 0 and goes to age 5, and it's much more intensive, 8 hours a day. But the training components in ABC and Perry are much more similar than people think. A big part of the ABC program is basically child care, taking care of children when the parents are working. So what do we need? We need to understand exactly what these programs do. And this is something that I've participated in very actively, and I have a series of papers. So one thing that these programs did, and it caused all kinds of difficulty, it still plagues the literature today. Perry Preschool program started out at age 3. The treatment children, it was randomly assigned treatment and control. The treated children had a huge boost in IQ, which created a lot of excitement in the larger environment. And then gradually it petered out. So by age 10, the treatment group and the control group had basically the same. And this led to a huge and unproductive literature. This and similar findings for Head Start, and a literature that still continues to this day. There's a group at the University of California at Irvine that basically, dwells on these kinds of graphs and really misses the point fundamentally. Namely, that what we see is, yes, there was fade out, but it turned out when we looked at this more closely, that the tests that were used here were different from the tests here. And we use consistent tests, and we follow these children not to age 10, but to age 55. We find lasting effects of these programs. I'll show you what they are. So this was misleading. But also it turned out that basically these evaluations looked only at IQ. But remember, I told you that IQ was only part of the story. And it's not necessarily the most important part of the story. The famous American comedian Woody Allen had a kind of a nice apocryphal quote saying, oh, 70% of success was showing up, but it's persistence that matters. Angela Duckworth calls it grit. Other people call it conscientiousness. But most sociologists, most psychologists, most economists who study the matter know that persistence, the ability to stick with a problem, to stay the course, is a very important determinant of life success. So we know that Perry was not a failure. Why? Because now we followed these people into their 50s. And we know that the children who were treated had far better life outcomes than those of the control group. They did better in school, they had higher levels of employment, and they lived healthier lives. And if we look at the economic rate of return, not that there's an argument that's been put out by some crackpots at Harvard called saying that we should use the marginal value of public funds. If you look at a true cost-benefit ratio, something at a Hotelling and Harberger and most and Feldstein, serious political scientists and serious social political economists and public finance specialists would look at, namely, what's the return when you take the opportunity cost of taking money from the private sector and transferring to the public sector, so the real social cost, plus any tax avoidance cost. So if you account those, you still find that the rate of return is somewhere between 7 to 10% per annum per pairing. And a key boost in this program is boosting executive functioning. It's the ability to control one's life and passions. And this is closely related to IQ. So executive functioning, I'll show you, executive functioning at age 55 for the peri-treated children are much, much higher than for the control children. So over their whole life, they have the greater ability to plan, to execute, and review their lives and make plans going forward. And so the program operated, a principal way it operated was not just through boosting IQ. It did that, as we'll see, but it also primarily worked through boosting social and emotional skills. And so what people say, even in those early years when the so-called IQ tests faded out, we saw that the test scores on achievement tests did not fade out. How can that be? Well, an achievement test is testing knowledge. And if children have a greater incentive to acquire knowledge, then they're going to actually then be better off. And so that means they're going to be able to look at the structure of, they're going to be able to persist. So even though they may be no smarter measured by this IQ test, they're going to be more persistent and learn more. But it turns out also that they were smarter. So we had higher achievement test scores. And so what happened? Well, these people who were in the original Perry program are now in their 50s. Most of them have children. So we can ask, how are their children doing? Are there any effects into the second generation? Do the current children have any effect on the next generation children? And what we know is that achievement tests, that the effects lasted over generations. So I'll give you an example. We can look at the children of the original Perry participants. They're in their 20s now, on average. You know, children are born at different ages. The children, the more educated Perry participants had their children later, but nonetheless, they're mostly had their kids now, and these kids are mostly in their 20s. And what you see is that the children of the treated group were much more likely to have not been suspended from school, to have completed schooling, to have less crime, and to actually have a college experience. So these children are benefited. So it's not just the first round that participates, you're building successful lives for the children. And why? Well, here, this is very interesting. The Perry children, the people who were original treatment group, were much more likely to be married over the course of their lives. And these are the years when couples stay together. The rate of death, I mean, you know, by age 50, the marriage rates were not as high. But in this period, the men were married, and these are the treated children, these are the controlled children. And their children were being born in this period. So in this period, there was a stable marriage rate. And children and the parents were actually very, very successful as families. They had stable, warm, encouraging families. So they were more likely to be married, and they were more likely to have earnings, because it turns out those parents, those participants in the crucial childbearing years, 25 to 45, were much more likely to have higher earnings. And they were much less likely to have arrests. So the treated group is here, the control group is here. So they're much less likely to be in crime. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why the earnings are higher. They're actually not caught up in that. So what happens then is that there is a second generation effect. Now, the ABC program was founded 10 years later. It was developed for a group of children in North Carolina, but it shows, again, it's a more intensive program. Remember, it starts at 0 and effectively goes to age 5. And it shows benefits from a comprehensive approach. And we know when we measure it correctly that it actually boosted IQ. And it boosted IQ. We have data now to age 45 for these children. And so what were the secret ingredients of these programs? It improved parenting practices. It had a positive effect on behavior. It had higher educational attainment, higher employment rate. It reduced criminal activity. It had better child and adult health. And this is something that people never thought about. Remember, the program did not target health directly. It did give a nutritional supplement, but it was a very small part of it. It had very little. There were some doctor's visits early on, but this wasn't the main thing. And the controls got many of those visits as well. Well, if you go out to age 35 for the males, we can see that the blood pressure of the treated group people much lower than for the control group. So this is 125 versus 143, the systolic. The diastolic blood pressure also improved greatly, 78 versus 92. So if you look at measures, for example, of hypertension, much less hypertension among the treated group, much more, much better cholesterol, HDL cholesterol. And we can see then that obesity, not as strong effects, but an effect, and metabolic syndrome that is a precursor and a signal for diabetes. So what we can actually see is health effects. You say, well, wait a minute, this wasn't a health intervention. This didn't do anything about building hospitals or educating more doctors. But this is exactly the point I was trying to get at when I talked about fragmented solutions. So what was going on here is that the structure was such that the child that was able to control one's life. So this part of executive function, the ability to manage oneself, to read health warnings, to be able to then eat healthier, to avoid risks, all of those things translated into greater health for these children. And when we capture these full returns now, including health returns, we see benefits that are actually even higher than before, namely close to 14% for males, 13.7% overall, a little less for women, because one of the great returns, of course, is crime, and crime is much more of a male activity than a female activity. So what happened was, it also turned out to enhance the income of mothers because it produced daycare. So a big problem for working mothers is daycare. So we can see that if we just break down the benefits and the costs are substantial. So it costs $23,000 in this is 2020 dollars. We cost something like $23,000 for Perry and something like $100,000 for ABC. Very high cost. And that's been a barrier to adoption. And therefore, many people started to ask, can we do better? Can we do something? So the ABC programs were very effective. It boosted IQ, it boosted health, it boosted marriage, it actually reduced fertility, it allowed people to have greater control over their own lives, less criminality and the like. And it created real consequences for the male and the female children, that both the children of the the male children and the female children, both were much better off. So what are the mechanisms underlying? Why did these programs work? It enriches the home life of children outside of a child care center. So it's not like we send the kids to the school, the center, and the center patches them up and no, the crucial thing is it increases parental engagement and it increases the parent-child interaction. So if we measure parenting, we can see it in Perry, we can see it in ABC, that in both cases, the parenting distribution is shifted out in a beneficial way, more active parenting for the treatment and control children, for the treatment children versus the control children. And we can see that a big chunk of these treatment effects come from parenting received, from boost in early cognition and so forth. And what we also see is something very remarkable, and I think very important. If you look at the intergenerational relationships between the second generation and look at the children themselves, what we see is that the control children this is what the control children are getting in terms of education. So this is the relationship between the education of the father and the education of the son, or the education of the child, whether it's the daughter or son, and the education of the parent. So we can see a very strong relationship Remember that curve I showed you at the beginning, that beta? Well, this is a good measure of how strong that beta is in the natural state when children aren't treated. But look at the beta when you give these people this treatment. The relationship between the child's education and the father's education is basically zero, which means then the mere fact that my father's not well educated doesn't mean that I'm not well educated. So you break that link. You break the cycle of poverty. The same thing is true of crime. Very strong relationship. If the father's a criminal, the son's more likely to be a criminal. But now in this program, there's no link. You broke the link again. And again, this is true now for males. If you look for females, the relationship is not as strong with education, but it's still there. And of course, for females, crime is less of an issue. But again, the intergenerational link is broken. And so what's going on in these programs? The family life is strengthened. Parents are more warm. They're actually less authoritarian, but they have authority. So the notion is they're authoritative parents, but not authoritarian parents. So what are the essential ingredients? What do we do? So what's going on here? What should we learn from that in terms of shaping social policy? So what I've been doing recently is looking at programs that look at this one aspect of these programs. These programs do many things. They take children in, some of them send the children to doctors, at least early on. They do all kinds of things. They read to the children in various ways. So they're center-based programs. But what I've been looking at more recently is programs that actually focus only the home, that seek directly to improve family life. And they're much cheaper. So these are home visiting programs. Now, the Jamaica study is classic. It's an iconic program that's been replicated around the world. I'm currently studying it and replicating it in China, but I also have it in other countries as well. So the Jamaican intervention was an intervention done some 30 years ago now. It was a randomized trial. It was originally designed to look at nutrition, but it also, by accident, they created an arm in which there was no intervention. So there's a randomized trial. There was a group that only gave nutrition. There's another group that had cognitive stimulation. But what do I mean by that? It was a group that essentially taught the mother how to interact with the child. And then there were some that actually combined cognitive and non-cognitive interventions. And what it turned out is that these latter two categories, the visits that essentially stimulated the mother, basically were very effective. And these programs were very low cost. So instead of looking at something like $23,000 per child for Perry, you're talking with something around $800-900 at most, and in some cases less. In Jamaica, all of the books were made out of the village dump. The teachers who went there were not college graduates. The ones who visited the home were mothers who were more or less like the mothers themselves. They were people who had no higher education. They were just trained by people who did, but then they learned how to teach the mother to play with the child and do things like, oh, look at the bus over there. Let's take a look at this structure here. And it fostered engagement across those families. And that fostering engagement was really very important. And it turned out to have substantial effects. So we follow this. I've been studying the group. The children now, they were enrolled in the 1980s. Now they're in their mid-30s. So we're able to look at the outcomes of the treated children and the controlled children. And what we see is the treated children are much more likely to have college degrees than the controlled children. Much more likely to have attended college and much more likely to have favorable outcomes. If you look at the wage distribution shifted to the right, by which I mean there are more people with high incomes in the treated group than there are. This is a distribution. Everybody doesn't get benefit. People are heterogeneous, they vary. But on average, and even in terms of the distribution shift, the distribution shifted more advantageously towards higher wages and earnings for the children. So we can go through these statistics. I'm getting a little short of time and I won't go through that. But you can look at this. Now, I've also been doing work taking this Jamaica program to China. So we went to a rural region of China called Gansu. Gansu is in Western China, just south of Shenzhen, and it's a very poor area, one of the poorest areas of rural China. And what we're doing there, and a lot of parents in those families are migrating from the West to the East, as happened with industrialization in China. So that there's a lot of left behind children in those. And so what we do is we visit the mother if she's still there, or the caregiver, which frequently is the mother's mother. And the mother's mother can have very low level of education. And left alone, those mothers with low levels of education, not doing very well in terms of stimulating the children. But you can see when you look at what the effects are. Now, this is a new program. I was giving you results from Jamaica at 35. These kids are age 6 now. They're still very young. And we're going to follow these kids for many years. So there's still lots to do here. But what we're finding is strong effects on language, cognition, fine motor skills, and the like. And similar findings have been found in India, in Colombia, the country of Colombia, and also in Nepal. And so this program and programs like this are underway in Brazil with some very promising early results. And we look then at the cognitive skill and language skills. The treated group, the blue curve here, that shifted to the right. Children are more able, they learn higher language skills and they become more accomplished. And they're much more able to control their social and emotional skills. And their fine motor skill is also improved. So there's one last home. And the other thing, what is the intensity of this program? This program is 1 hour per week. It's not running a full day school. It's 1 hour per week. It's 1 hour, and the target is the mother. The mother is being taught how she can make materials from the local dump or from whatever is available and teach and interact with the parent, the child. And so the parent-child relationship is fostered. And that turns out to have those substantial effects. There's a related program that's called Preparing for Life, and that's called PFL. It's being done in Ireland. I played a role in this program years ago, started it. The person who's really responsible is Orla Doyle. So Orla has had this tremendous influence. These are all in the slums of Ireland, Dublin in particular. And this has a very similar strategy. I won't go to all the visits, but here they visit 1 hour a week, every 2 weeks. That's it. And sometimes some of the visits aren't even made, so it's 1 hour a month. So what happens then is that these children are getting what looks like a very limited stimulation, but the child isn't the target. It's the mother. It's the caregiver who's the target. And then the mother spends the rest of the day, the rest of the whole environment, the child grows up in and fosters and creates a wonderful environment for the child to take risks, to learn how to explore, and to scaffold in the sense of building and interacting, taking the child to the next best. So if we look, for example, at the children of the treated group, they're green here for the treated group, blue for the control group, we see a huge shift to the right. If we look, for example, of children who are basically have emotional problems, that the children who participate in the group have serious problems. Those who don't participate have serious problems in being autonomous, able to function on their own. Here, these children, much less among the treated group. They're much more competent with their peers socially. They're much less likely to be hyperactive. And if we look at things like ability to manage attention, to pay attention at school, to pay attention how to play in sports and to work with others, you're finding huge benefits. And so we can see that verbal ability is improved, mathematical ability is also improved, and the kids are less obese. And so what we see is something that's remarkable, a very low intensity program, Some of these programs are as cheap as $500 a year. These programs are competing with Perry in terms of raising things like this social mobility. So here's, for example, this idea of how much the control and the treatment group are getting. So we can see that the control group is up here. Well, let's just take a Perry. This is the Perry group in terms of education, crime for males and females. Here we can actually see this intergenerational preparing for life. There's a very, very weak link between the parent and the child. IQ link is basically eliminated. So even what we thought might be genetics doesn't operate. And so home environments are improved. And what's interesting is these low-cost programs turn out to be almost effective as the high-cost programs. And so we can see, if we compare the more sophisticated ABC Perry program with these other home visiting programs, we're getting pretty amazing results. And here we're using comparable scores, we're making comparable comparisons. So we're really getting something that's really very informative, I think. And we're getting then that both cognitive and non-cognitive skills are enhanced. And the reading scores, the math scores are very comparable. So a low intensity program that targets this one ingredient. So here's the point. These other programs are like umbrella. They're umbrella programs. They do many things. They target, they take care of the kid. They have nice warm beds. They have all nice facilities. They have teachers that have college degrees. These other programs are very rough and ready, not very highly trained teachers, only 1 hour a week, but it's with the mother and taking the mother and moving the mother forward into knowledge about how she can interact with her child. Then we look at the child outcomes. Yet later, in some cases here, much later in life, and we find substantial improvements. And this is a very important message. So what do we know? What we've come to understand, I feel a little bit like Madame Curie. I realize that's a probably very facetious and grandiose comparison. But remember what Madame Curie did, she and her husband. They actually isolated radium. So there had been this whole mystery that pitchblende, this ingredient that Becquerel had been found and accidentally left on a photo plate in his office, seemed to be creating rays, sending something out that affected the photographic plate. But nobody knew exactly why it worked. And that's been the case with Perry and with ABC. But what we did is we stripped out the parenting, mentoring, and parent-child. And the home visiting programs only take that one piece of those programs, only takes the interaction with the parent. And that proves something very, very powerful. It proves that these children are very, very, are getting some, and this is the ingredient, the universal ingredient. Early years are sensitive periods. But that means then that you can have low-cost programs, and that's why the Chinese are adopting these programs now on a wide scale. They can afford to do this in rural areas that don't have a high level of education, don't have a high level of support. Remember, in China, it's a fairly rich country, but the provinces are kind of on their own, very decentralized system. So the education system, the early child care system is all provincial focused. So this is way that poor provinces, and there are plenty of poor provinces in China out in the West, that these can essentially then offer these services. But let me just conclude briefly that the early years are sensitive periods, but I will point out that skill development occurs over the life cycle. We really want to understand that. Human development continues through later childhood. So we don't want to just think of stopping investing in children. That's stupid. We know that. Enriched, for example, I'll give you an example of where mentoring works. In Chicago, we have a whole disadvantaged population, primarily African-American, very poor kids, very poorly trained kids. Family life is bad. But what's happening then at age 4 is that some of these kids then are taken out, put into what's called an enriched charter school. And these children are starting at age 4. And this features mentoring through elementary school. So the kids are given a mentor. What is that? It's a surrogate parent. It's a person who plays the same role that the parents are playing in these home visiting programs. They encourage the child in school, they stay with the child, they allow the child to fail, and they encourage the child when the child fails, but encourage the child to succeed. And so what we see, they did a randomized trial of children, and now looking at grades 3, 4, 5, and 6. And they had a lottery, and the people who were in the lottery, the winners, were the treated children. And there were substantial differences in terms of test scores. Now, these are now achievement test scores, but there were substantial differences that favor the children. And so I think that's very, very powerful. And it shows then the notion of mentoring is a recurring theme. There's another program in Germany called Baloo and Do, which takes the same idea and drills it forward into the adolescent years. So children in middle school and in high school will also get that kind of mentoring. And again, it's a very informal program, but they give the child a mentor. So we can see is huge effects on achievement tests. The treated children are doing much better. Adolescence is also a major target of opportunity, Baloo and Do, and a whole series of other programs. But mentoring is just age-adjusted parenting. And so what we find throughout the lifetime, mentoring and encouragement is a huge component. And earlier we engage the parents or the caretaker or the family supporting the child doing that activity, the more likely we are to have successful children. And so we know from the pure biology of how the prefrontal cortex is developing. Prefrontal cortex is associated with executive functioning, with decision making. And what we see is that we can nourish that slow developing prefrontal cortex, and that regulates decision making and judgment. So what we understand now is the importance of the early years. This is a very simple schematic. Social and emotional skills promote cognitive skills and health. Why? Because more motivated people, more determined people, people who are persistent will acquire knowledge. They will also take care of themselves in terms of health. Healthier children at the same time are more likely to be able to learn and to engage in the larger society. Cognitive skills now allow people to acquire education at a faster rate and to promote learning and promote engagement in a larger society. So there's interrelationship among these skills. But what we've learned is a fundamental principle that economists call dynamic complementarity. Investing early creates greater receptivity to investment in the future. And this is something that we need to know. And this is something that we learn and something that has become a powerful lesson. And how does that get these high returns? Because if I invest early and create a motivated, engaged child, then at every stage of the life cycle, the children will gain. And there's a kind of increasing returns quality. So the next stage, they become more efficient, more productive. And then the next stage, more efficient and productive. And that becomes very, very important. So this accounts for those very high returns. The children who are invested in early, we now understand much better the source of those returns. It's the engagement of the parent and the caretaker in the life of the child. So if we do a schedule, it's easy to misinterpret this schedule. I think we should really understand it. What this shows is that the prenatal years and the early years have very high marginal products of investment. That's not to say that you can't get a very high economic rate of return for job training. That's not what this is saying. But it's saying if you would take the first unit of value, whatever it is, baht, a rupee, whatever, if you take that, invest it in the child, what you can see then is that first is going to be highly productive. Why? Because it creates the skill base that makes later investment productive. So it's not to say that there's no productivity out there. There's a lot of productivity, but any productivity that comes from schooling comes from the early investments and the the family life, and the engagement. So I think we need to understand that these programs are very, very powerful. So let me just summarize by saying skills matter. Skill gaps by family background are real, but they can be addressed. And so the fatalism, at least in the United States, if you show skill gaps between different groups, Black children and white children, there are real skill gaps. There are skill gaps between Chinese children and Caucasian children. But those children, and they're in favoring the Chinese children. A lot of Asian American children are better, but they're also better partly because the family life is so strong. And we know it's not just a question of the tiger mom for the Chinese American child, but it's also the fact that the Asian family, at least as it comes to the United States, tends to more strongly invest in children. But not all families do. It's that family engagement and the parenting and scaffolding that play such a role. So it's families that are the main producers of skills, not schools. And what we need is a comprehensive approach to skill formation that tells us how we should measure these programs, how we should measure success, and what skills are really important. And what we should in the United States anyway recognize that many people are compromised. And if there are children in Thailand on the streets, then we recognize that for them, some kind of mentoring and parenting is going to have to play a huge role in promoting their well-being. But we also know that in families that are intact, giving parents knowledge, it's amazing, but it's true. There's some very, very good studies by Flavio Cunha, somebody that T knows very well. Flavio Cunha established early on that parents of these very disadvantaged children don't understand what the normal growth trajectories are. They don't understand their own power. And these programs help turn on the child's parents or caregivers to a greater understanding of what they can do, and frequently they use the knowledge. So I want to thank you very much, and I certainly am willing to take questions, and I apologize for the late start. I didn't intend to start late. I think we got a miscommunication about times, but here we are, and we've gotten together. So please let me know if I can help in any way and answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Professor. This is a very useful and inspired talk. So I have just a few questions for you. So the first one would be more like broad policy oriented. So how can you move from this research to convince policymakers? I don't know. I mean, what's your experience? How do you do that, and how successful it is?
Well, I wish I could tell you a great success story. It's still highly debated in the United States. And the reason why it's debated is there's a feeling that these programs are intruding in the life of the child, and that they're government programs that are basically intruding, and they're shaping children, whereas parents and family feel it's their job to shape the values and goals of their own children. So there's a very important that we basically work with the family on its own terms. And that we view this, it doesn't have to be a government program. Government can pay for these programs, but it doesn't have to be a government program that provides it. It could be a temple that provides these programs, a church, if it's a Christian church. It could be some kind of community organization. It doesn't have to be a government program. It could be a government program. But the crucial thing is to deal with the family on its own terms, and to be seen as offering advice, offering guidance, but not telling people what to do. That doesn't work, at least in the United States, and I'm sure around the world. Nobody likes to have somebody come in and say, this is how you should raise your kid, or you're not being a good parent, or something like that. Nobody wants to hear that. I certainly wouldn't want to hear that, and I doubt that any of you would. But I think what we can do is tell parents how effective, and show them, and the home visitors working with the parents or caregivers can actually do exactly that. they can give guidance and they can provide children with opportunities to essentially that they wouldn't have. And the parents are the main providers. So it's not like building a school. Schools certainly help. I don't want to ever be seen that somehow schools don't matter. Schools matter a lot. But the successful schools are schools that are supported by strong families. And strong family is not just a matter of cash. It's a matter of engagement, supporting the child and getting the child engaged. So telling the child telling the parents of a child what a normal growth trajectory is and what they can do and how valuable it is. Many parents don't. There are certain groups in the United States that literally don't know the value of actually talking to their children. That they think it's not worth anything. In fact, there's some groups in the US that actually believe children shouldn't talk and they should be silent in the presence of so the idea is to learn engagement of the child, to engage the child and then let the rest take over. I think maternal and paternal love are powerful motivators. And I think we should just turn it on and facilitate it. So, and if you take that message, then a lot of people who are anti-government or people who are fearful of government intrusion, and in the United States, that's true of both Republicans and Democrats. And I don't know the political situation so well in Thailand to comment about parties, but I do know that these kinds of fears are real, that parents want to be given tools to advance their child's well-being, but they should also be told and understand how powerful their role is. And I think if we do that, then we can actually have a very beneficial role.
Yes, thank you. The second one is, I remember many years ago, I met you in Chicago and maybe with Professor Lars Hansen as well.
Sure.
You guys
he just celebrated his 70th birthday, by the way.
Oh yeah, I saw from Facebook and
yeah, it was good. It was a very nice affair.
Able to go. So you guys talking about child left behind. So I think that must be part of your experience in China Rich program. That actually is not mother who home visitor go and visit, I guess. So what's that experience? So how difficult it is? Is this program actually fit with this grandmother?
Yes. Yes. In fact, we find some of the strongest effects. Remember, in China, there's been a massive increase in the level of education across cohorts. So you have some children, some people born, say, in the 1930s and 40s, grandparents still alive, maybe in the 40s and 50s, but the level of education is low for the grandmothers frequently. 2 or 3 years of school. The mothers generally have 10 years of school in these rural areas, 10 years, because China's been very successful in boosting its education level. So what you see is something very interesting, that even with the grandmother who's less educated, if you teach her these basic principles, and they're intuitive at some level, that they can be engaged in a very constructive way, and these programs are very effective, especially for grandmothers. So it's not a question, it doesn't have to be the mother. The mother plays a powerful role. The child bonds more with the mother and the father, but often the grandmother in China anyway is living in the family. I visited one of the places I visited a few years ago was Tibet. We went out from Lhasa in Tibet, about 100 kilometers west of Lhasa, way up in the mountains. It was high. And we visited a rural area, and multiple generations were living together. So there was no question of the child left behind. These were rural people. They had yaks. They were growing crops to feed the yaks and all of the crops that are grown in Tibet. Beautiful place, but it was also something, the grandmother was there and the mother was there. And I saw a home visit. The home visitor came in. The home visitors were not highly qualified in the sense of having advanced degrees. They were, however, trained in this curriculum, how to engage the mother. So these people were like at 10 years of school, not And they were more or less at the level of the mother. But when the mother was there, or even just the grandmother there, the grandmother would learn, they would engage, and then, but the way it would be engaged was that the caretaker, the visitor, would work with the mother and the child, or the caretaker and the child. And so you could see the engagement that the child was having with the mother or the grandmother improved a lot. And I think when we go forward and measure the impact, we haven't studied yet the outcomes. It's too early in Tibet yet to really evaluate. But my guess is you're going to find that those very, very poorly educated grandmothers are going to actually pick up on this, because these are basic human intuitions. I mean, it's not like you're telling, it's true that the vocabulary of a grandmother with a low level of education isn't going to be as great as that of a mother with 7 more years of school, no question. But a lot of the motivation and encouragement, it can still be there. And there are other friends and families. And so engaging these people around the village, the group, and encouraging the child, playing with the child, plays a very powerful role, even when the grandmother herself is not that highly educated. So I do believe it's effective to do so. I don't think you need to have an educated mother. I mean, it doesn't hurt, but I think it certainly is a case that you can deal with that. And we've studied it.
Yes, well, thank you. And then hopefully we will learn that in Thailand as well. As you know, we are launching a project that's similar to that. And hopefully you...
Yes, I'd like to be informed of
part of it.
Yes. In fact, why don't you team up with us at CEHD?
Yes.
Actually, one thing that CEHD is launching is a program like the Irish program, actually, in one of the local areas. This is an Hispanic area in North Chicago. So we're actually now launching this program. So we have literally, we're going to have some meetings in a few weeks getting the program going. We got some funding from an entrepreneur, and I believe that the structure is going to be very successful. We'll see. We can evaluate it. We'll have research gains from it, but at the same time, we will also have tremendous benefits in the sense of, I think the children will benefit as well.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So,
EAF
yes,
would be
but I'd love
to
to team up with you. I'd like to see what you're doing, to share your knowledge. You've seen our papers now on China Reach, right?
Yes. Yeah,
And
that's
we have
very
new
interesting.
ones. Yeah, we have new papers on measurement and new papers on development. So did you get this paper called Interactions as Investments?
Mhm. Yes, that motivates us how to measure things in our project as well. And we will contact you and then work with you for comments.
Good. Well, let's team up on this. I'm more than happy to be a part of your group.
So, I mean, there's several more questions, but I think the time is up. So I have a few quick questions for you. One is more research, and I think it must be easy to answer, hopefully. So I think we know that in the Perry preschool and also ABC, yeah, they have both schooling and parenting feature in the programs. But somehow I'm not sure if you already know if they are very complementary or whether they are substitutable. Do you have any answer on that, or should we run an experiment or study on that further?
Well, there's been some attempt to do that, to be honest. Orazio Atanasio, in particular, and Costas Magir have also tried to modify the Jamaica program in various environments. And some have looked only at the center-based activities. They modified the programs. The modifications for the center-based programs, to my knowledge, to my reading, haven't been that successful. But that doesn't answer your question, which is complementarity. So the question is, what else is going on in these programs? Well, some of it is that the center staff is reading to the parent, reading to the child. So it's taking over some of the tasks that the parenting program is having the parents do. And the difference is the intensity of the program will only be a few hours, even a day. But if the mother's there and talking to the child and really understanding how powerful her role, or the caretaker, or whoever, the grandmother, is taking care of the child, she will understand, and it's a she usually, she will understand the powerful role that she has. And they will be careful in dealing with the child and understanding where the child's at. And the idea of scaffolding is then finding where the child is at and taking the child to the next level. And that I think is very important. And I think that can be taught. But we don't know. You want a kind of an elasticity of substitution between those two activities. All I can say is that one is much more costly because it has setting up a center, it's training these people, it's doing all kinds of things. And this other is doing only one activity. So what we know now is that one activity is highly effective. And the question will be, and if you look at what the Jamaica program is doing, we're getting rates of return on Jamaica that are comparable. Remember, Jamaica is only an hour a week too. So this is a very low intensity program. What we're finding is rates of return. We haven't quite finished the cost benefit study. We did get the data. The Rockefeller Foundation years ago funded the study, and it's taken us a while to process the cost data, look at the returns. But what we're finding is rates of return that are really quite high, that seem comparable to pairing, but I don't know. So in that sense, I would argue this, and this is kind of it's not answering your argument directly, but it's saying if I take this one ingredient out and apply it, I'm getting very strong effects. And therefore, it might be from a policy point of view to say, well, if I don't have a lot of money to spend, I might want at least to get this ingredient out there. And the other components that are traditional in these programs. I mean, there's a program here in the United States called the Nurse Family Partnership Program. It's run by a very well-intentioned doctor at the University of Colorado in Denver. I know him. He's very controlling individual. He's a very, very, and he's got a very rigid schema that only registered nurses can be part of this program. And these registered nurses have to all be trained in Denver, Colorado, and on and on and on. And what I would argue is that defines a rigid protocol that doesn't have any transportability to other environments. It's not going to be usable in places that are out there like Gansu. And my guess is in Thailand, there's some pretty remote areas too, out in the rural areas. And these programs transport. Gansu is a rural area. And they can be done in a way that's very low cost. We've also talked a lot about applying this program. We haven't done it yet, but adapting the program to nomads in Xinjiang. There are sheep herders who work these herds out in the Kazakh part of Xinjiang, north. And they travel around. They don't live in one place, but they can still be visited. And the way they can be visited, that the structure is that we can go with jeeps now. I mean, you don't have to ride a horse out there anymore. And you can follow the nomads and you can contact them and provide that visit. So you can actually then provide a structure that actually does do a home visit, even though the home is a yurt or some kind of nomadic tent. So I think it's very flexible. And if that's true, but if you think about it, I'm not saying anything very profound. The real shortage in the human race, there was a famous economist named Dennis Robertson. He wrote a book about many things. We wrote lots of books, but he had a very famous quote. And his quote was really more about human sociability and trust. But he said that the commodity or the thing that was most scarce in human society was love. And I think that's important. It is love. This thing that's the most scarce is providing this love, this nourishment, this provision of well-being for the children. And I think that is a powerful, powerful thing that we tend to underestimate. And in this whole world of education and blackboards and textbooks and standards, we kind of lose sight of the fact that it's the parent and those interactions with people that all of you, I'm sure, can talk about, the parents. I know that T had very strong positive interactions with Rob Townsend and others at Chicago, but even earlier, each of us can go back to important stimuli, but we can then cultivate that more. So it sounds very soft and sentimental, but actually it's not. I gave you high rates of return. I gave you what are very, very effective rates of return that I believe will be found. The current Jamaica study is showing a relatively high rate of return, about 10% per annum. So I don't want to go to the wall and say that is true, but I believe that we can actually focus on that. If it's really a question of priority, obviously we can always do better. We could have a richer environment maybe, but the question is, do we need it? And what's the secret sauce? What is causing these programs to work? And I think it's just enhancing the home and doing so in a voluntary way that parents will participate in this and will engage in a very important part of their lives.
Thank you. So this must be your last question. So it's more macro. So
Okay.
I think there's always a debate between targeted policies versus universal policy. I think I would like to hear your opinion on that.
Yes. No, I've looked at this question a lot. In the United States, you're talking about child care policies in particular.
Yes.
I mean, targeting is I mean, look, even in the case of treating COVID, some good economists like Darano, Samaglu, and others were properly pointing out that whom should we target during the period with the vaccines and with the shutdowns? In that case, it was clearly the people who are most vulnerable, people with inflammation conditions, the very old, the one with conditions that were leaving them at risk. So that's common sense. And now, of course, we know it to be true. So the general lockdowns, this universality, most people now concede was a waste of time and money. Cost a lot in society. It hurt. There are a whole set of discussions here. But in terms of childcare policies, universal is not needed. I mean, families that are relatively well off and that provide these rich family lives, they don't need these programs. It certainly doesn't hurt to help them, advise them. But you saw the graph that I had, that the more affluent families were spending many more dollars and taking their children, engaging in many more activities than the poor families. So it's the poor families who are the ones that don't have the information that probably should be targeted, if only in a sense of priority. We can say, where are we going to get the highest returns? Sometimes there's a political issue that's involved here. And that is, we want to make it universal so we don't stigmatize the poor. Okay, that's fine with me. I'm not opposed to that. But then I would have a sliding fee schedule so that the very rich, if they use these programs, would be charged high prices. The very poor would not be charged or anything. So I think that way we could eventually avoid the stigma, but then allow the take up. It's a kind of a self-selection mechanism so that people you could sort of screen people out who are truly needing the program and willing to pay for it in a fundamental way versus, and if more affluent people want to participate, then let them in, but they should pay their own way.
Thank you. Well, this is a very lively and useful and intense discussion. It would be even better if you were here personally.
Oh, I'd love to be there. I actually would.
We would love to have you here.
No, my son's relatives live in Thailand, so he's visited several times. He told me once he went out to the countryside and went into some tiger cage. I have a picture of him inside a cage with a tiger. I don't know if that's that common for tourists. It seemed a little dangerous, but I know that when I was there in Bangkok with you, I thoroughly enjoyed my visit. I was telling somebody about that visit today, and you took me to a famous temple in Bangkok.
Yes.
And I remember one thing. I mean, it was a very beautiful temple. There was a Buddha that was very artistically made, very beautiful, very artistic, moving Buddha, very, very. But I didn't know any better, and we were sitting down on the carpet in the temple, and I remember I just took my shoes off or whatever, and I put my feet forward. He said, no, you can't do that. That's not the way you respect the Buddha. So I learned something there. But I found Bangkok to be very exciting and stimulating, and I would love to participate. Is Rob Townsend coming to Thailand much these days?
Not in the last couple of years, but usually he will come every year.
Yeah, his wife is Thai, and so
Yes.
she still has family in Thailand, right?
Yes, I think her hometown is up north, Chiang Mai.
North. Okay, yeah.
So
No, but he
yeah,
has a deep interest, and your work still continues. So it's, I would say to the audience that doesn't know T, that this work with Rob Townsend that he's done is fundamental research. It's really understanding financial liberalization, how to build a financial infrastructure, and really understand how to create markets, financial markets. So I'm very, very much appreciative of your work with Rob and all that you're doing, and plus your own theoretical work on. So I'd love to work with you on this. And there's so many theoretical points to discuss. So they're issues of measurement, but they translate directly into policy. That's the interesting thing. So it's not just an abstract exercise. It's an exercise that can benefit the next generation and create a better generation, a healthier generation of Thai children.
well, yes, it would be an honor for me and my team and other scholars here in Thailand to work with you more on these.
Well, we should formalize that.
Yeah.
Literally sign an agreement, but have you come here at once. We have plans for you to come here anyway, right?
Yes, well, that would be great. But that before COVID, and then because of COVID, so we canceled the conference.
Yeah, I know. The whole COVID is really messed up everything. But at least we're talking to each other now. Here in Chicago, we are really, I'm back. We're back to meeting and going to seminars. And honestly, it was like a curse was lifted. People sitting in isolation. It was almost like being in jail in solitary confinement. Very bad. So everybody's happy.
Yes, well, that good to hear, and yeah, I'm looking forward to work closely and form a partnership with the Center of Economics of Human Development, CEHD. And thank
Yes.
you very much for tonight. And I would give the last word to Grayot, the director of EEF. So he would like to say thank you to you personally. And thank you.
Okay, very good.
Thank you. I have to look to you through the camera to say a proper thanks to you. I think one of the lesson I learned from today is that not only there is a causal relationship between parents and the child. I think there are some causal relationship between the professor and the student that make a lasting impact to the policy, not only in the US, but in China, and hopefully one day in Thailand. On behalf of the Equitable Education Fund and the organizing committee today, we very committed to the development of early childhood and the investment in a long-term technical and policy program to learn from the experience on the literature and the special lecture you have given today. And it will be more powerful if we could finally accommodate you in Thailand personally.
Well, I hope so. I hope so.
Yeah. And so you can not only see the beautiful temple and Buddha, but to see the beautiful life of young children and parents in Thailand to change in a better way from their poverty and from their disadvantaged background through research and through a very good technical knowledge from our colleagues in the international level that can really change life in Thailand. And I wish to see you witness what T and his team have done in the past few years and many more to come. So look forward to meet with you, and hopefully the next flight I'll try to book to Chicago not cancelled by any pandemic ever again. So
Yes, please come and visit us.
Yeah, so we can formally form the technical and policy alliance and invite you to Thailand again soon. So on
Good.
behalf of
That's
all
great.
of us, thanks so much to you, and I will go back and check the US election result later tonight. So good luck with what happened in the US politics for today. Thank you so
Okay,
much.
very good. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.